welcome to Our Changing State, the podcast. I'm Matthew Petty, host of Florida Matters on WUSF 89.7. For this podcast, we're taking a deep dive into topics that seem to be changing by the minute, from the environment and the economy to our politics and culture. For decades, people have been drawn to Florida by the warm weather, the beaches, theme parks, and lack of state income tax. But in the past few years, Florida's booming population has shifted those changes into overdrive. Our reporting for this podcast included an online survey where we asked people like you to share your take on this state we call home. Well, that's right, you and your neighbours drive the conversation we're having with residents and topic experts. Thanks for being here. We hope that we all learn a little more about our changing state in the process. Florida has long been seen as a purple state, a place that can tip a presidential election for Democrats or Republicans. Governor Ron DeSantis' emphatic re-election in 2022 appeared to seal Florida's identity as a red state, and a wave of polarizing policy choices have made this state something of a testing ground for an uncompromising brand of conservatism. But with a diverse and growing population, our state's politics are more nuanced than election results might suggest. And we're putting your questions and concerns about politics to our expert guests. But before we get to that conversation, we pay a visit to someone who's been steeped in the politics of Tampa Bay and Florida for decades. Pasco is among the top 10 fastest growing counties in Florida over the last decade, and driving through the county, growth and development are everywhere. But in Land O'Lakes, not far from the big box stores and highways, a dirt road sheltered by tall pine trees leads to a slice of old Florida. Here, a white two-story farmhouse sits behind a huge oak tree.
Hey there.
Dr. McManus, how are you?
I'm doing fine. Come on in.
Thanks. A few years ago, University of South Florida Professor Emerita Susan McManus retired after 47 years teaching political science. But the 76-year-old is still a familiar name, face, and voice as a political analyst. This farmhouse and the property that sits on a small lake has been in McManus's family for 100 years. Today, it's a haven for animals like owls, bobcats, armadillos, and gopher tortoises.
Oh yeah, there are 3 or 4 of them around here.
Yeah.
We have different names for them. The big one's Gramps, and then there's George, and then there's Tiny. You know, those are the 3 main ones. They live along that fence line. That's their favorite.
As we walk around the property, 4 deer wander past. Dotted around the garden leading down to the lake are animal sculptures McManus's mother designed from old farm machinery parts.
My sister and I are really the only ones of the cousins that still love to swim in the lake, but we do. When she gets home in a couple weeks, we'll get out here and clean out these lily pads. We try to keep this area free for the boat and also just to swim.
This is kind of your antidote to the wildness of Florida politics.
Absolutely, yes. Yes.
Tell me about how you got into politics. What drew you to this life?
My family was always current events focused. Our discussions were always about what's going on and talking about why, and it was never a vicious discussion. When I went to Florida State as a freshman, I was planning on majoring in, of all things, physical education because I grew up with sports and I loved it. But once I got there, I had terrific teachers, and the proximity to the Capitol, I would just find myself just walking down to the Capitol and walking around, never realizing what I would do. But I changed my major at the end of my freshman year to poli-sci.
As you were kind of talking about your family, as we toured the house, you were saying your parents were from different political parties, and there was a lot of political diversity in your family overall.
Right, a lot of diversity. The broader extended family includes everything from Baptist preachers to railroad union leaders and everything in between, mostly farmers in between. Yeah, we saw a lot of differences. I just grew up with it, and I think it made me a much better professor because at USF at the beginning of every semester I would ask my students what they were to give me a little bit of an idea, and I always explained to them before I took the survey. I said, look, our parents are one of each, and I wouldn't have a job if it weren't for politics being different. And then I would ask them which way they leaned, you know, Democrat or Republican or what. And invariably in my Florida politics class, it would almost be divided. And I never wanted to alienate by becoming ideological and forcing my views on others. I'm very adamantly opposed to that because it's one of the problems we have right now is people don't learn to listen to somebody else's viewpoint.
When you look at what's happening in Tampa Bay area and some counties in particular, say Sarasota County, what strikes you as the most interesting or noteworthy things about how the landscape has changed politically in the last few years?
Well, this area is still the most diverse, and so one of the things that's happened is the age makeup of the areas and some of the counties have changed, and a lot of that is driven by changing technology and a diversifying economy, which we've certainly seen in this area. But COVID is a prime example of how younger people migrated to this area. There were jobs, it was open. So politics have changed tremendously. When I was young, Pinellas was the first county to go Republican, and now it's a very competitive county. Sarasota also Republican, more heavily Republican now than it used to be. Tampa, a little bit more Democrat than Republican. It used to be the bellwether, but it's not anymore. The significance is that the in-migration changes everything. Whether it's in-migration that reflects age differences, racial or ethnic differences, or even party affiliation differences. My lesson in teaching Florida politics for years was you cannot, in a state that sees so much infilling and even movement within the counties between elections, you can't take data from 2 years prior and really feel confident in a lot of counties in Florida because things change that quickly. The biggest mistake some people make in Florida as candidates and as parties is not doing enough demographic work, and it has to be done constantly because we have such, churning of our population within the state and then new people moving in and some people moving out.
If you'd like to hear an extended version of each episode of Our Changing State, or if you'd like to listen to archived episodes of our weekly show, Florida Matters, visit our website, wusfnews.org. Well, joining me is Tara Nusum, Professor of Social and Behavioural Sciences and Founding Director of the Centre for Civic Learning and Community Engagement at St. Petersburg College.
Great being here. Thanks for having me.
We're also joined by Eduardo Gamara, Professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations and Director of the Latino Public Opinion Forum at Florida International University's Green School of Public and International Affairs. So our audience raised concerns about gerrymandering, voting rights, education, the lack of compromise in politics today. Here's a comment from Haley Bush of St. Petersburg, who says, gerrymandering has tipped the scales and allowed extreme politics to take deeper hold in Tallahassee. Moderates on either side are not rewarded on our state and national political stage. I think the average Floridian and average American wants to see a return to a sense of civility in politics. However, not everyone was unhappy with the direction the state is headed in politically. Here's Pamela Spofford in Stewart, who wrote, very happy with what the governor is doing, nervous that there will be repercussions due to his tough stance. Before we do get to more comments and questions from our listeners, though, I want to ask both of you what you see as the biggest and perhaps most consequential political changes in Florida. Tara, what comes to mind for you?
I think the focus on culture wars that Rick Scott really started when he started to dismantle programs in the state of Florida and really turn us from a moderate state to a more conservative state through pushing back against federal funds for Medicare, to pursuing state legislation to give drug tests to those seeking temporary assistance. Those were all the beginning of the culture wars that we're living out right now with Governor DeSantis. And they're a far cry from the kitchen table issues that most Floridians are really worried about. And so I think that's the most concerning piece, because we have real things that we need to work on: climate change, affordable housing, access to healthcare, bodily sovereignty. And I think most people really want us to pivot back to those issues.
Eduardo, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with Professor Nusum, but I would just add I think a very important kind of structural caveat. All of those things that the professor is mentioning are largely possible by two things. One, the fact that Republicans have been in control of the state now for the better part of 2 decades. And secondly, that this was largely cemented with this absolute control of all institutions in Florida, the legislature, the executive branch, but also the judiciary, which in some measure, I mean, this may be a far-fetched comparison, but we have a one-party state now, and a one-party state with a governor who essentially runs the state, not much different than we might see in other parts of the world, with a strong ruler with absolute control through a single party. So that has enabled this governor to be able to essentially do whatever he wants to do, and with popular support.
Let me turn to some audience questions and comments. And the politics around education was a recurring theme among our audience. Asked about political concerns, Jackie Brethen of Wesley Chapel said she had, quote, "None. I am on board with the decisions to keep our kids safe and keep perversions out of the classroom." On the other hand, Joanne Glazewski from Venice wrote, "Our education system is embarrassing. Teacher pay is among the lowest in the country. Education regulated by our governor. Children taught what to think, not how to think, turn into parents who can't think, hence our political landscape." Eduardo, what do you make of the politicization of education in Florida?
Right now, at least in terms of, the impact it's having locally on public education, I think it's very significant. But from where I sit, and where I think Professor Nusum sits at the even at the university and college levels, this is having a dramatic impact. It's having an impact on how we teach our students, how we can engage our students. It essentially tells us that our PhDs, the way we've been designing our courses, is not enough anymore. Now we have to listen to elected politicians telling us how to teach our courses, when to teach them, and how to engage our students. So it's had, I think, a very tempering impact. Some of our faculty, my colleagues, are afraid of the environment that we live in. Some of our colleagues are they want to take on the establishment, and still others have just become completely apathetic. So I think across the board, this environment has had a dramatic effect on Florida education overall, and not for the better.
I want to read a quote from Julia Casimir from Sarasota, who writes, "I used to be a DeSantis fan, but as a teacher who now more than ever is targeted by the media and the politicians, which leads the masses to believe that I am a terrible person, I am disappointed. No words can describe the fascist healthcare bill, SB 1580 or 1718. And just as a reminder, Senate Bill 1580 allows healthcare providers to deny care based on moral, ethical, or religious beliefs, while Senate Bill 1718 is a sweeping immigration law that, among other things, cracks down on businesses which hire undocumented immigrants." Tara, a couple of things to unpack here. First of all, what's your sense of how teachers are perceived in Florida and the media's role in that? And I also wonder if you could talk a little bit about the political climate that has led to the passage of laws like SB 1580, which is kind of on the intersection of healthcare and religious freedom.
Well, I think Julia is experiencing what many academicians are really experiencing, that, the idea that there's a moderation in our legislature and our policy would lead to the support of educators, and this authoritarian spin on how to direct how we teach, what we teach, is creating a pushback from not only teachers, professors, but I think the public. I certainly think that we've forgotten in Florida, and possibly on the national level, the idea from the framers called the American gospel, that in public spaces that we have to have tolerance and support for different ideas. And, a great example of this actually living out, and it's hard for me to actually reference a deep red state like Utah, but the Governor Cox there, when challenged about the anti-LGBTQ laws in his state, said he wasn't going to support them because he was more interested in supporting the vulnerable populations of our state, our children that might be facing mental health crisis, and to let them live, rather than to use education and public policy to suppress or oppress those that are vulnerable in our communities. And so I think, educators and voters are all seeing these culture wars play out, and they see them for what they are, authoritarian extensions of a government that doesn't have a check. There is no checks and balances. And so we, the voters, need to be the ones that check and bring truth to power. And that's what I think the voters are starting to express with these comments.
Eduardo, what about Florida's immigration bill? I wonder if you see the response to that from Floridians as really clearly defined by what party people do belong to. I mean, how important is that issue for, say, Hispanic residents and voters, other voting blocks?
You have to look at this in the following way, at least in terms of what the research that we've been doing tells us, right? And let me sort of begin by noting something that has happened just recently here with a Marxist group of students here at FIU decided to have a conference, right? A session where they were going to talk about these strange ideas. This has made it now onto TikTok and onto whatever other social platform. So now there's a demonstration outside of FIU by the community, right, against what is ostensibly a student group. This kind of, I think, illustrates where we are, where we have the idea of a university being a place where ideas can be discussed to what the majority out there in the community wants to impose on us, and what a governor and his political agenda want to impose. This is, I think, where we are. But looking at that specifically in terms of what the research tells us, most of the respondents tell us that they want a society of tolerance. They want a society of ideas. They want a society of divergence. So until, to a certain extent, we can move beyond this moment of authoritarianism, I think it's going to be a while. I mean, this isn't going to happen in this electoral cycle, certainly. But we're ways from going back to, hopefully we will, going back to those moments in which we could talk about different points of view without trying to clamp down on those with whom we disagree.
Eduardo, I wonder what that tells you about some of the key concerns of voters, no matter what party, and where are some of the areas where political leaders could find consensus?
The focus on wokeness has sort of obscured the real issues affecting Florida, and even among Republicans, right? When you separate the wokeness kinds of questions in the surveys that we do, most Floridians agree, right? We have a serious insurance crisis. We have a serious environmental crisis. I mean, even today, the Marco Rubios of the world who used to say that, climate changes all the time, right? Even Marco Rubio now believes in climate change, right? And so even conservatives are talking about some of the real issues that are affecting Florida. The problems of flooding, for example, that are now a real crisis in the city of Miami and in Fort Lauderdale. The whole issue with traffic, for example, on some of the local polls that we do here, number one issue is traffic. And traffic is related to what? The lack of infrastructure and the lack of, primarily public transportation. There is no reliable public transportation here. And then the rent, the cost of rent, in most urban centers in Florida, rent is a huge issue. So this overwhelming focus on wokeness has essentially rendered, I think, this administration absolutely useless on addressing the key issues that affect Floridians.
I want to ask both of you where you see the state heading politically from here, and is there perhaps a less polarized, maybe less partisan political future?
I think a lot of it is going to depend on what happens in the next 12 months politically at the national level. I think we're in such a convoluted period with such a deep divide. And I think it's going to really depend on where the national politics goes. My sense is that Florida will largely remain red for the considerable future, but I think there's going to be some interesting turns, particularly in urban centers. I think Democrats are going to regain ground in the urban areas of Florida.
Tara, what about you? What do you think?
Well, I certainly hope that we turn towards a moderate expression in our representation in Florida, because I think that's really what Floridians want. I think it's a mistake to look back at the last gubernatorial election and think it was a mandate for Republicans or even a mandate for Governor DeSantis. It was an unprecedented investment in him and the Republican Party, and a very weak investment and resourced in Charlie Crist. And so if we can, implement the fair districts laws and really have our representation kind of erode gerrymandering, we might start to see Democrats not only do what Professor Gamarra said, is be visible in our urban centers, but start to be more visible on the state House and state Senate side, or a really healthy litigation in the federal courts that strikes down Governor DeSantis's redistricting. So I think that the future of Florida really is a lot more moderate than we think, but our institutions may not reflect that moderation until the next census.
I want to thank you both for joining me. Tara Nusum, Professor of Social and Behavioural Sciences and Founding Director of the Centre for Civic Learning and Community Engagement at St. Petersburg College. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
And Eduardo Gamarra, Professor in the Department of Politics and International Relations and Director of the Latino Public Opinion Forum at Florida International University's Green School of Public and International Affairs. Professor Gamarra, thank you.
Thank you very much. A privilege to be with you.
Thanks for listening to Our Changing State. Find more details about this series from WUSF Public Media, including photos of the people we're meeting across the Tampa Bay region, on our website, WUSFnews.org. Find us on Facebook and Twitter. You can also stream our weekly show Florida Matters every Tuesday at WUSFnews.org. Our producer is Denora Prevost. Our podcast producer is Scott Wachtler. We also received support for this week's episode from engineer Jackson Harp, digital editor Carl Lischendrello, and news director Mary Shedden. I'm Matthew Petty. Thanks for listening.